Is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency following the science when it's telling the people it must cull hundreds of healthy ostriches located in Edgewood, British Columbia to protect the people from avian flu? Actually, now they claim not just any avian flu, a mutant one. Now, some of you are probably thinking, Drea, you answered that question in your question. It's obvious. No, they're not. But I'm not an expert. So today I interview a expert on the matter who finds the CFIA's science hard to believe. In case you're watching this and you're like, what is she talking about? Ostriches? You've been living under a rock. You should know our special website called SaveTheOstriches.com has all of the background on this developing story of immense government overreach. But in short, as I'm filming this, the CFIA and farmers at Universal Ostrich Farms are at a standoff because the CFIA raced there to try to beat the farmers in killing their flock before the farmers could go through the Supreme Court to try and oppose the cull order. Now, the farmers have always maintained the position that yes, some birds got sick, less than 15% died, mostly last year, a little into the beginning of this year. But for the last 270 odd days, the remaining birds have been healthy and asymptomatic, and not a single one of them has been tested. But the CFIA has dug their heels in and said they should die anyways. It's at a standstill because the courts actually are reviewing whether or not the farm can take this to the next step in Supreme Court. So today I thought we'd dig into the latest scientific claims and some of the older ones, which is the 2 PCR tests that were used on 2 deceased carcasses back in December to go ahead and issue this whole cull order. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, and that specialist who joins me now's name is Dr. Stephen Pelech. He's a tenured professor in the Division of Neurology in the Department of Medicine at the University of British Columbia and Chief Scientific Officer and President at Connexus Bioinformatics. And here's what he had to say.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things here that raise red flags to me. I mean, firstly, the birds were actually, only 2 birds were tested. And as you know, this was after they had been dead for at least 16 hours. Some people say over a day. And in order to recover material, genetic material for the PCR test, that's fine. You can recover genetic material from sewage water. So there's no problem there. However, recovering active virus that you can propagate, purify, propagate, and then test on animals is a totally different story. And I had read the document that Dr. Furness had supplied as an expert for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in the courts. And in the document, she actually refers to information provided to her by the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. And the individual is claimed to have said that the type of H5N1 virus that was recovered in part from these ostriches, it's called a D1.3 variant, and that this has been the most virulent meaning that it causes death very easily, it can spread easily, and it caused death easily in mice that they tested at the National Microbiology Lab. But the problem is, it's from the statement that was made, even though it was a quotation, and there's absolutely no material provided, data or references in the report that was provided by Dr. Furness to the appeals court where this information first came out. So there was no opportunity to actually review any of that data. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, it's actually hearsay data. It's not actually documented information. So we don't know whether or not was actually the virus from the farm that was recovered, that was tested in these birds, or was it actually a pure D1.3 variant, which I suspect is the case. And I think that Dr. Furness herself misunderstood or probably didn't clearly think this through, that it was actually the virus from the farm, even though she stated it was the virus from the farm. Because, like I said, this is very, very difficult to isolate a purified, virus from a sample recovered like that, because the virus is not very stable in the environment. So
Right.
that's one thing.
Hmm.
And then what kind of mice were they testing? Normally, an avian influenza virus very poorly infects mammals like mice and people, but it works very well on birds, and which could include ostriches as well. So to have this variant be more lethal than apparently an influenza strain that was recovered from cows that got infected with H5N1 in the States, that's unusual because, like I said, the virus is optimized for infecting birds. This
Hmm.
is the reason why in North America, uh, we've only had barely 70 odd cases of H5N1 in the last 5 years, and only one case in Canada. It's
Hmm.
very, very difficult to infect mammals with the avian virus.
And
So
that.
I think she's wrong on that account, and unfortunately, it's been taken, I think, out of context, and then it's been the mainstream media has now got this impression that this virus is mutated and it's a deadly virus, and they mentioned in originally in the court that there was a reassortment,
Hmm.
that this was a mix of actually, as it turns out, D1.1 and D1.3 viruses,
Hmm.
and that this was unique. However, what we do know is that the CFIA has already seen over 100 different reassortments because Catherine Furness herself, under cross-examination in court, mentioned this, and there's also documented in literature well over 100 reassortments. So this is not unusual to have a reassortment,
Hmm.
and the reassortment is with a highly pathogenic version, with a low pathogenicity version, which accounts why only about 15% of all the birds that were infected on the farm
Hmm.
actually died.
Right.
85% recovered. And in order to qualify as a highly pathogenic virus, you would expect about 85% to die.
And the average person, like myself, we don't understand all this. And,
Right.
so many people are sitting there going, why is the CFIA doing this when clearly these animals are no longer ill? And so when they say, hey, this is among the most virulent strain they've ever tested in the laboratory, it does sort of give an answer to some of those people who maybe were still questioning the CFIA. Now, I want to talk about the actual testing. Because one of the things that the farmers have been consistently asking for in court, in interviews, and only up until recently have, taken the CFIA at their word when they say it doesn't matter, and I'll explain that in a sec, is the retesting. They want better testing. They want blood tests. They want to be able to prove the health of their animals. The CFIA has taken the position that it doesn't matter because of their stamping out policy. If they test them and they had the virus, it doesn't matter how long ago they had it, they all must die. But let's talk about those initial tests, because I know during COVID, I did the reports, I probably interviewed you about it, about the
Mhm.
concerns involved with diagnosing anything with the PCR test. And it's my understanding that the concerns are heightened when the threshold is overcycled, which I hear was the case here. Can you talk
Right.
to us about that a bit?
Sure. Well, we're talking about the PCR test, the polymerase chain reaction test. And what that test does, it has two components to it. The first component is you amplify the amount of starting material, the genetic material, in a sample. So you can double the amount of DNA. DNA is what is being actually tested here, except these birds are actually have RNA genomes. So we convert the RNA to DNA, and then we use the polymerase chain reaction to amplify. And every temperature shift or cycle that they do to low and high temperature doubles the amount of DNA in the sample. And it's kind of like 2 to the 35th power or 36th power of doublings that have been done, so that ultimately you amplify the amount of starting material by hundreds of trillions of times. Now, the second component is that the sensitivity of the test itself, the detection system, whether or not the particular DNA sequence that would correspond to being from the virus, in this case, the H5 gene, is actually present. But you have to have enough genetic material before you can detect it. So we have what's called cycle threshold, CT scores, and that's going to be the score at which you can start to detect the presence of that target gene sequence. So it's a little confusing because you have CT cycles, which is referring to the number of thermal cycles, and there's cycle thermal cycles, but also cycle threshold. So what happens is most of the time when these tests are done, and we did this for example, for COVID-19, we had PCR tests, and that was detecting the gene for the spike protein of the virus. And there, actually, the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg had determined that if you had to amplify the amount of genetic material in a sample by more than 25 cycle times, then that material would not cause an infection of cells in culture if they were introduced to the virus. But you would still detect it by PCR if you amplified further, that at least you knew that the gene was likely present. However, it's not necessarily an intact virus. It could most likely be fragments of the RNA, because RNA is very unstable in the environment. This is the reason why the influenza virus itself is being an RNA virus, contrary to what has been suggested by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, is not going to be persisting in the grounds of this site or anywhere else because of microbial action and UV radiation from the sun just mutates the genetic material so much and cuts it up that it's just not going to survive. So this is one of the concerns when we were getting it from dead birds, whether or not it actually was even in the birds or did it come to the birds. But subsequently, the CFIA did do testing where they sequenced the complete genome. And in that case, we know it's an H5N1 virus, and we know that it's a reassortment of a mix of two previous viruses that infected the same bird and the same cells of that bird. But that bird was probably not an ostrich. It was probably one of the wild birds that had infected the herd of the ostriches, because they all have the same, the only two they tested had the same reassortment. I mean, it's very unlikely.
Right.
Yeah.
So just for clarity, people should be reminded that none of the living birds that are alive today have ever been tested.
That's correct.
And of course, the farmers want that, but they're also pushing to change the policy that says it shouldn't matter.
Well, here's the problem too, is that in the courts, even the judges, repeated this statement in their decisions from the federal court of Canada. They said that, the birds are tested positive for H5N1 highly pathogenic virus. And that's just not true. The only tests that were done was for H5 and H7 at the time that the call order was given. It was only later that this full genome sequencing showed that it was an N1 virus as well. So, and it's never been tested for its pathogenicity in culture, to my knowledge, from the virus isolated from the ostriches. I do think that it had been tested for the D1.1 pure strain, but 1.3 pure strain. But I don't think these viruses from the actual birds has ever been tested. The version that is from the ostriches, it's a mix, it looks to be low pathogenicity because, as I said, only 85% of the birds survived, whereas we would expect, if it was highly pathogenic, that 85% would have died.
Well, let's talk about the whole concern for the public that these birds must be mass called, no matter how healthy they are, because they pose a risk to the public and to trade. Let's start with the public as well. At
Sure.
first, what do you make of that?
Well, that's again pretty ridiculous based on even the Canadian Food Inspection Agency itself does state on their website that if you have food that's from an
Yeah.
infected bird, that it's still perfectly safe to eat.
Yeah, it says
So
there's no evidence that
that it's
transfer them.
transmissible.
Mhm.
There's never been a case, and the H5N1 virus and its various strains has been around for over 60 years. And there has been deaths where people have been infected, primarily in Southeast Asia, where probably the medical care was not as good. In North America, with the strains that we have here over the last almost 5 years, there's only been about, like I say, about 72 cases in that range, and only one in Canada. And of those, there's only been one, maybe two deaths from H5N1 in people.
Mhm.
And there's never been a case documented of H5N1 from a person who was infected with the virus that's actually spread it to another person who got the virus. And most of the cases in North America where it has been detected, they've been either, quite a few of them are actually asymptomatic. They didn't even know they were infected.
Mhm.
And in most cases, they're very mild. And in fact, most of them are people that are involved in culling operations where they
Mm.
detected H5 and they decided to cull all of the chickens. Because, we've had like about 160 million chickens killed in the United States and about 14.5 million killed in Canada in the
Mhm.
last couple of years. So those are the most
Mostly in
dangerous
BC.
operations is actually when they're culling the birds.
Right. As is other risks, I would imagine, when you're doing something like that.
Right. But
Uh,
the other thing too, Julian, I've said it before, you've got these wild birds flying
yeah.
overhead and landing in parks and fields and schoolyards, excrement everywhere. They're all
Mhm.
infected birds. And yet we don't have these cases of H5N1 in the general public. So I think the risk on the farm is
Mhm.
so minimal when you compare to what the situation is just in the lower mainland of British Columbia with all of our migratory birds coming and going.
Well, here's just a little bit of footage of the farmer's neighbors. It's also extended family who right now their property's been seized too.
The reality is that the World Organization for Animal Health has guidelines, which the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is trying to adopt. But how they adopt those guidelines is really up to the agency itself. So, for example, the ostrich farm is actually in its own zone. So, in that zone, no poultry products would be able to be really sold internationally because of this adoption of the World Health Organization policy. But the policy is that if you have an outbreak of the H5N1 in a zone, then if you kill all of the birds in contact with the infected animals, then after 1 month, that zone is declared disease free because we know that after about 2 weeks, after you have a recovery from infection, the immune system of people or animals will basically destroy the virus and it's not transmissible.
Mm.
The other opportunity, and by the way, that 1 month wait period was 3 months actually before 2025. So they shortened it, again,
Mm.
recognizing that the risk is much less. Now, if you don't call the birds after they've been detected, but you wait a year, and this is called like a burnout,
Right.
then you regain your disease-free status.
Hmm.
Now, the argument the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has given is that, well, some of those agreements that we have with other countries, like Mexico and Russia, are based on the whole province. So if you have an outbreak anywhere in the province, then you lose your disease-free status for that particular trade agreements. That's just what's negotiated between these particular countries in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you have an outbreak anywhere, for example, in British Columbia, then you lose it. It's not just the ostrich farm. And
Mm-hmm.
last year, we had over 40 outbreaks within BC alone. So the chances are, now I understand that there was an outbreak a few weeks ago in Saskatchewan and they had to kill all the birds.
Right.
So
So they
we
say.
know it's
No,
still in the
I'm
wild.
just
We
joking.
know birds can still get, our domestic birds can still get
Yeah.
infected on the farms, but it's very likely that we're going to see it again here in BC. However, we don't know how pathogenic it really actually is because until we did these ostriches, we never had a chance to test to see whether or not the virus in the environment that's in the wild populations has now mutated to a more benign form
Mm-hmm.
that maybe is more infectious, but much less virulent. And we don't know the answer to that question apart from the data we're seeing with these ostriches.
Mm. So much is on the line here if they do slaughter them, at least scientific wise. Now, you said something there about how in their zone there would be no other poultry
Right.
moving. But something that really confuses me is that this whole stamping out policy, when I look at the WOAH, is based on poultry. But my understanding is that these birds, these reptiles, are not poultry.
Yeah.
So could you help make sense of what that means as far as having H5N1? Does that matter at all if they're not poultry? Should they be treated the same?
Well, I think it probably doesn't matter as much because, we have cows that have been infected in the United States, not yet in Canada, but in the States with H5N1, the avian virus. We don't generally kill the cows. There
Right.
is a compensation that package that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency will allow for particular animals. For ostriches, they're saying they're worth about $3,000, and for cows up to $10,000. Certain other animals, elk and all that, will be in that range. But the ostriches are valued relatively low. And again, it's not because these are important for their meat, because they're not actually being used for human consumption. They're being used to generate antibodies to fight
Right.
infectious viruses. This is the irony of all of this. The information from these ostriches is vital for us to help better fight future infections of H1
Mm-hmm.
and to detect it and maybe even to prevent it from spreading with filters and masks, for example, in farms that could be used if they're under a threat of a H5N1 infection.
Mm-hmm. But you just said something there. You said we, as in the United States, who I'm assuming to a certain extent, based on what I've heard with RFK about what they usually do, also follows this stamping order. And
Well,
they
they
don't,
have,
yeah, they have in the
but they're
past. They're trying
revisiting
to,
that because it's not working.
right.
The
They're,
reality is you still get every year
yeah,
infections. And what goes on in the farms is actually relatively irrelevant to the spread of the virus because it's being spread by the wild animals. So this
exactly.
is this is it.
Yes. So he wants to move away from it, and he's not convinced that leaky vaccines is the answer,
Mhm.
Health Secretary Kennedy. But you said even though the U.S. at some point has been following the stamping out policy, they don't typically kill cows
That's right.
because they are not poultry. So what I'm getting at here is why do you think, what do you make of the CFIA's argument that these birds who are not poultry should be treated the same as the chickens?
Well, I think that first, they probably haven't encountered this really much before. And by the way, the CFIA does not have to provide compensation that's fair market value.
Mm.
And my argument is that even the eggs from
Mm-hmm.
these ostriches, if they're full of antibodies against the virus, or can be
Yeah,
used to develop antibodies against cancer proteins, for example, that they have more value in just an egg, probably $10,000 to even $40,000, depending upon what the antibodies are targeting. just in the egg. And each ostrich can lay about 40 or more eggs per season. So offering $3,000 for an ostrich is actually really, really lowballing the real value. And it takes a long time to recover an ostrich farm to get, birds that will be producing eggs as opposed to like chickens. After about 3 or 4 months from the baby chicks, they're being
Right.
harvested. So that's why they're cheap.
Well,
Different situation with ostriches.
and maybe I'll put this little meme up here too, where it shows the CFIA and the Liberal government working really hard to bury the antibodies. It's hard not to be a conspiracy theorist or realist these days. Let's end on what you think the solution is. Maybe through this discussion, we can kind of see what that is. But what would you say is a better way to tackle this virus?
Well, I think first of all, they should be testing these birds right away, using even the PCR test or a rapid antigen test to confirm, there were suspicions that these birds are still infected with the virus and shedding the virus, and that may get spread to wild birds who then go and frequent other commercial farms, which are then going to infect their birds, and then the people that are handling those birds, and that gets into our population. You can cut that all off by just simply testing these birds and seeing, do they actually have a virus? I would be so shocked if, in fact, they tested positive for any virus for influenza at this point in time. But if they did, then now we've got something really interesting. Like, is it possible for these birds to be asymptomatic? That is, they have no signs and yet they can still be shedding? Because in order to be transmissible, you have to have a high viral load. And it's going to be basically breathed out by these birds and inhaled. It's not really spread in drinking water. It's not spread from getting off the ground. Influenza doesn't work like this in people, and it doesn't work like this in animals either. So this is like I would like to see us do more experiments to follow the health of these birds. How long will they maintain their resistance? Do they have antibody levels that are they not going to get infected again when we have another cycle of influenza and wild birds coming? Can these antibodies themselves that are in the birds' eggs, and these should be really replete with large amounts of antibody against the entire virus. I mean, these antibodies can be valuable for research purposes. They can be used to see if we can have filters created that can capture the virus from the air in some of these farms that are at high risk. Can they be used also for treating people who have had influenza and they need basically an antibody treatment, like what we saw with the monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19, or if someone who has a snake bite, they're getting antibodies to fight that snake bite venom. Can we do the same thing with these ostrich eggs, where the antibodies in those eggs are actually very stable to high temperature and wide ranges of very acidic and basic conditions? They're ideal for industrial use. So there's so much that we can do with these.
At Rebel News, we expose government overreach. And if you appreciate our efforts to do so in this very important story, please consider supporting our work by sharing it and donating what you can to cover the expenses at SaveTheOstriches.com.